This HOA arrested a woman over her lawn. It didn't end there. It started with a patch of brown grass, a minor flaw in a neighborhood where every lawn was a perfect, manicured green. For one woman, a recent widow just trying to hold her life together, it was the last thing on her mind. But in this community, the Homeowners Association saw more than just a dry spot on the lawn. They saw a violation. Fines quickly turned into relentless threats, and the threats escalated into something unimaginable. They didn't just want her to fix the grass, they wanted to make an example of her. For the crime of an imperfect lawn, she was put in handcuffs, placed in the back of a police car, and thrown into a jail cell. But her arrest wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her revenge. What happens when a system designed to protect property values tries to destroy a person's life, only to find out that person is ready to fight back? The house on Sycamore Lane was meant to be Evelyn's forever home. She and her husband, David, had bought it 5 years ago, pouring their savings and their dreams into its 4 simple walls. It was in Harmony Creek, a sprawling suburban development where the name felt less like a description and more like a command. Every home was a slight variation of the next, with perfectly aligned mailboxes and sidewalks so clean they seemed to wash themselves. David had loved it. He saw the structure, the order, and felt a sense of security. He was the one who spent his weekends with a ruler, measuring the height of the grass, a cheerful participant in the neighborhood's unspoken competition for the most immaculate lawn. To him, the thick binder of Homeowners Association rules was a funny quirk, a manual for peaceful living. To Evelyn, it felt like a book of unwritten threats. After David's sudden passing 6 months prior, the house felt different. It was no longer a shared dream, it was a large, empty container for her grief. The silence was the loudest thing in it. His tools sat untouched in the garage, his favorite coffee mug was still in the back of the cabinet, and his presence lingered in every room like a ghost she couldn't bear to face. Simply getting out of bed in the morning felt like a victory. The routines that once structured her life, work, errands, social calls, had become monumental tasks. She moved through her days in a fog, the world muted and gray. The lawn, David's pride and joy, was the last thing on her mind. That summer, a brutal Texas heatwave had descended upon Harmony Creek. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth until it cracked. Watering restrictions were put in place, and across the neighborhood, the once vibrant green carpets began to show signs of stress. But Evelyn's lawn fared the worst. Without David's constant loving attention, the aeration, the fertilizing, the deep watering at dawn, it began to surrender. A small yellow patch appeared near the driveway, and within 2 weeks it had grown into a large, unmistakable blotch of dry brown straw. Every time Evelyn pulled into her driveway, the brown patch was a fresh reminder of her loss. It was a visible symbol of the life that had been ripped from her home. It was David's absence, made tangible for the entire world to see. There were days she planned to deal with it, to go to the hardware store and buy seeds and fertilizer to try and bring it back to life. But the energy never came. The grief was a physical weight, pinning her to the couch, stealing her motivation, leaving her exhausted before the day had even begun. Her focus was on survival, paying the mortgage on a single income, navigating the mountain of paperwork that comes with death, and trying to remember how to breathe. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't mailed, it was tucked into her doorframe, a crisp white envelope that felt cold to the touch. Inside, the letter was formal, impersonal, and sharp. It was from the Harmony Creek HOA Architectural Control Committee. It cited a violation of Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Community Bylaws, failure to maintain aesthetic uniformity and landscape health. Her brown lawn was officially documented, a problem to be solved. The letter included a grainy black and white photo of the offending patch, as if presenting evidence in a trial. She was given 14 days to remedy the violation. Evelyn stared at the letter, a strange mix of anger and exhaustion washing over her. It was so absurd, so clinical. It didn't know or care that the man who tended that lawn was gone. It didn't see a grieving widow, it saw a compliance failure. She crumpled it up and threw it in the trash, dismissing it as a bureaucratic nuisance. They didn't understand. She had more important things to worry about. The grass could wait. She assumed that was the end of it, a single shot across the bow. But in Harmony Creek, the HOA didn't fire warning shots. They had already started building their case, documenting every day the grass remained brown, its file growing thicker in a sterile office just a few blocks away. The watchful eyes of the neighborhood were not just neighbors. They were extensions of a system that demanded perfection, and Evelyn's very visible pain was ruining the view. The 14 days passed in a blur of grief and exhaustion. Evelyn didn't fix the lawn. She didn't have the strength. She had almost forgotten the crumpled letter in her trash can until the second one arrived. This time, it wasn't just tucked in the door. It was sent via certified mail, forcing her to sign for it at the post office, a deliberate act of intimidation. The tone of this letter was sharper, colder. It referenced the first notice and her failure to comply. A fine of $100 was now attached, with a stern warning that the penalty would increase for every week the violation remained unresolved. The impersonal bureaucracy was no longer just watching, it was beginning to extract its price. Annoyance simmered into a hot, defensive anger. She was being punished for mourning, fined for a pain that was not her fault. A few days later, she saw the face of her tormentor. An older woman named Carol, the head of the HOA's Architectural Control Committee, was walking her small, yapping dog along the sidewalk. Carol lived 3 houses down, in a home with unnaturally green turf that looked more like a putting green than a lawn. She paused directly in front of Evelyn's property, her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. She pulled a small notepad from her pocket and began writing, her eyes flicking from the brown patch of grass to her paper. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was a warden patrolling her prison. Evelyn, watching from her kitchen window, felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood, it was personal. Evelyn began to notice things she hadn't before. The Petersons' house at the end of the cul-de-sac had a basketball hoop that was never put away, a clear violation of the bylaws. The family across the street had mismatched solar lights lining their walkway, throwing off the aesthetic uniformity. Yet no one seemed to be documenting their infractions on a clipboard. Evelyn was one of the few black homeowners in Harmony Creek, a fact that had never felt significant until now. She couldn't prove it, she couldn't even say it aloud without sounding paranoid, but she started to feel a creeping, sickening certainty. The rules were for everyone, but the enforcement, it seemed, was selective. Her grief made her vulnerable, and her visibility made her a target. Defiance began to set in. It was a quiet, stubborn resistance. She would not give them the satisfaction. The third letter arrived, the fine now at $250. The fourth followed a week later, raising the total to $500. The language grew more hostile, referencing further sanctions and legal remedies. The numbers were becoming terrifying. The part-time job she worked didn't leave room for hundreds of dollars in fines for dead grass. The financial security David had built for them was being chipped away, piece by piece, by an organization that was supposed to protect their investment. Deciding she had to face them directly, Evelyn attended the next monthly HOA meeting. The meeting was held in the sterile, beige community clubhouse. She sat in a folding chair, her hands trembling in her lap, as Carol stood at a podium and went through the agenda. When they reached the open forum, Evelyn stood up. In a quiet, wavering voice, she explained her situation. She spoke of David, of his love for their home, of the overwhelming grief that had consumed her life for the past 6 months. She didn't make excuses, she simply laid out the truth, hoping for a flicker of human compassion. She received none. Carol looked at her with an unnerving placidity. "While the board offers its condolences for your loss," she said, her voice devoid of any actual sympathy, "personal circumstances do not exempt a homeowner from their contractual obligations. The bylaws exist to protect the property values of all residents." The board members nodded in unison, their faces impassive. Her pain had been weighed against property values and found wanting. She left the meeting feeling humiliated and utterly powerless, the last ounce of hope draining from her. The final straw came in a thick envelope from a law firm she didn't recognize. The HOA had hired lawyers. The letter informed her that due to her continued and willful noncompliance, they were placing a lien on her home for the accumulated fines, which had now swelled to over $1,000 with administrative and legal fees. A lien. They were threatening to take her house, David's house, their dream, over a patch of dead grass. The fear was no longer a quiet dread. It was a choking, all-consuming panic. She spent the next few days in a state of frantic anxiety, trying to figure out her options, but she felt trapped. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of her house, and now even those felt like they were closing in. One evening, as dusk settled over the eerily perfect lawns of Sycamore Lane, there was a loud, authoritative knock on her front door. It wasn't the soft tap of a neighbor or the thud of a package being delivered. It was heavy, official, and it echoed the pounding in her chest. Heart racing, she crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing on her porch, their forms silhouetted by the setting sun, were two uniformed police officers. Her hand trembled as she turned the deadbolt. When she opened the door, the last rays of the setting sun were blocked by the two broad-shouldered officers on her porch. They were impassive, their faces set like stone, giving away nothing. One of them, older, with tired eyes, held a clipboard. "Are you Evelyn Miller?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She could only nod, her throat suddenly too tight to speak. He looked down at his paper. "Ma'am, we have a warrant for your arrest." The words didn't register at first. They floated in the air, nonsensical and absurd. A warrant? For what? For a moment, she thought it was a terrible, cruel mistake. They must have the wrong house, the wrong person. There must be a misunderstanding, she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer looked up from his clipboard, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. There was no malice in his eyes, only a weary resignation. "The warrant is for failure to comply with court-ordered sanctions regarding municipal code violations," he recited, the legal jargon sounding alien and monstrous. It took a second for the phrase to translate in her mind. Municipal code violations? The grass, the fines, the HOA. They had actually done it. They had turned a dispute over her lawn into a criminal matter. The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just a threat in a letter anymore. It was here, on her doorstep, wearing a badge and carrying a gun. The officer gestured slightly. "Ma'am, I need you to step outside and place your hands behind your back." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. This couldn't be happening. She thought of David, of how he always felt so safe here, and a wave of hysterical, bitter laughter almost escaped her lips. As she stepped onto the porch, the metallic click of the handcuffs was deafening in the quiet evening air. The cold steel bit into her wrists. It was a feeling of ultimate, irreversible humiliation. From the corner of her eye, she saw a curtain twitch in the house across the street. A few doors down, she saw her, Carol, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, bathed in the glow of her porch light, watching with a look of undisguised, triumphant satisfaction. The public shaming was part of the punishment. Evelyn was being paraded out of her home like a common criminal, the spectacle a warning to anyone else who dared defy the aesthetic standards of Harmony Creek. The ride in the back of the police car was a silent, surreal nightmare. The familiar streets of her neighborhood, streets she had walked with David while dreaming of their future, now seemed foreign and hostile. Every manicured lawn, every pristine home felt like a judgment. She was the blight, the piece that didn't fit, the nail that had to be hammered down. The officer in the passenger seat didn't look at her, focusing instead on the laptop mounted to the dash. The driver was equally silent. To them, she was just another pickup, another body to be delivered and processed. She was no longer Evelyn. She was cargo. The police station was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic cleaner, and the echoing clang of steel doors. The process was designed to strip away every last piece of her identity. Her fingerprints were taken, her fingers rolled in black ink by an officer who handled her with bored indifference. She was ordered to stand against a wall for a mugshot, the flash of the camera branding her as a criminal. Then came the inventory of her belongings. Her purse was emptied into a plastic bin, her car keys, her phone, and finally, her wedding ring. She hesitated when the officer asked for it, her hand instinctively closing around the simple gold band. "It comes off," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As she slid it off her finger, a sob caught in her throat. It felt like losing David all over again. She was given a faded, navy blue jumpsuit that smelled of bleach and despair. Her own clothes, the last remnants of her life outside these walls, were folded and placed in a plastic bag. Dressed in the anonymous uniform of an inmate, she was led down a long, concrete corridor. The air grew colder. The sounds became more menacing, a distant shout, the rattling of keys, the omnipresent hum of industrial ventilation. Finally, a heavy steel door was unlocked. The guard gestured for her to enter a small, dim cell. Inside, there was a metal bunk with a mattress no thicker than a textbook and a toilet-sink combination bolted to the wall. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound a definitive, soul-crushing finality. She was alone, truly, utterly alone. She sank onto the cot, the rough material scratching at her skin. The full weight of the injustice crashed down on her. Jailed. She was in jail because her grass was brown, because she was grieving, because a vindictive woman with a clipboard and a legion of faceless board members had decided to make her an example. She thought about her white neighbors with their minor, ignored infractions. Would they have been hauled from their homes in handcuffs, or was this special brand of humiliation reserved for her? That first night in the cell was the longest of her life. Every sound was magnified. The cough of an inmate down the hall, the footsteps of the guards, the drip of a faucet. Sleep was impossible. She lay on the hard cot, staring into the oppressive darkness as waves of fear, rage, and profound helplessness washed over her. The HOA, with the full, unquestioning power of the law behind them, had taken everything. They had taken her money, her dignity, and now her freedom. They had pushed her and pushed her until she had nothing left. Lying there in the cold, sterile darkness of the jail cell, the tears of fear finally stopped. The trembling in her hands ceased. The helplessness began to curdle, hardening into something cold, solid, and sharp. They thought they had broken her. They thought they had won. They didn't realize they had just stripped away everything that was holding her back. They hadn't just made a victim, they had created a warrior. Evelyn walked out of the county jail after 7 days, blinking in the bright Texas sun. The world felt unnaturally loud and chaotic after a week spent inside a concrete box. The guard at the release desk had handed her the plastic bag containing her belongings with mechanical indifference. As she slid her wedding ring back onto her finger, the cold metal felt different. It was no longer just a symbol of her love for David, it was a symbol of what she had endured and a reminder of the fight to come. She was not the same woman who had been escorted from her home a week earlier. The grief was still there, a permanent ache in her heart, but it was no longer a fog. The fear was gone, burned away and replaced by a cold, hard clarity of purpose. When she arrived home, the brown patch on her lawn looked exactly the same, but she saw it differently now. It was not a symbol of her failure, but of the HOA's cruelty. It was evidence. Her first call was not to a landscaper, but to a local investigative reporter whose blog was famous for exposing abuses of power. Evelyn laid out the entire story, the violation notices, the fines, the humiliating HOA meeting, the lien, and finally, the arrest. She gave him copies of everything, including her booking photo. The story that emerged was explosive. Grieving widow jailed for 7 days over brown grass. The article went viral overnight. It was a perfect storm of bureaucratic absurdity and human tragedy, a story so outrageous it could only be true. It was picked up by national news outlets, and suddenly Harmony Creek was famous for all the wrong reasons. News vans lined Sycamore Lane, their cameras pointed at Evelyn's lawn and the pristine, sterile homes of her neighbors. Carol, who had once patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard and smug superiority, was now besieged by reporters, hiding behind her drawn curtains. The perfect, orderly image she had fought so viciously to maintain was shattered into a million pieces. The public backlash was swift and brutal. An online group dedicated to supporting Evelyn attracted tens of thousands of members. People from all over the country shared their own HOA horror stories. The Harmony Creek HOA's social media pages were flooded with angry comments, and the board members' phones rang off the hook. But the most significant call Evelyn received was from a civil rights attorney in Austin. He had read the story and offered to represent her, pro bono. He told her this wasn't just a case about fines, it was a case of targeted harassment and a gross abuse of power. Armed with legal counsel and public support, Evelyn sued the Homeowners Association. The lawsuit detailed a pattern of selective enforcement and emotional distress, arguing the HOA had weaponized its bylaws to punish a vulnerable resident. During the discovery process, her lawyer unearthed emails between Carol and the board that revealed their vindictive campaign against her in damning detail. Faced with mounting legal bills and catastrophic publicity, the HOA's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Several board members resigned. Carol was voted out of her position in a heated emergency meeting where dozens of other residents, finally feeling safe enough to speak up, aired their own grievances against her reign. The HOA settled. The lien on her home was removed. Every fine was erased, and Evelyn received a substantial financial settlement for the damages and humiliation she had suffered. But the victory was never about the money. The first thing she did was use a portion of the settlement to establish a small legal aid fund, an organization dedicated to providing free legal advice to people being bullied by their HOAs. She never fixed the brown patch on her lawn. Instead, she hired a landscape architect and transformed it. She dug up the dead turf and planted a vibrant, sprawling wildflower garden right in the front yard. It was filled with black-eyed Susans, Indian paintbrushes, and bluebonnets, native Texas plants that were beautiful, resilient, and gloriously defiant of the neighborhood's rigid aesthetic code. It was a memorial to David, a splash of beautiful, untamed life in a sea of monotonous green. It became a symbol. Some neighbors still grumbled, but they never dared to send another letter. Evelyn Miller's story became a cautionary tale, a testament to how easily systems of order can become instruments of oppression. It was never just about a lawn. It was about what happens when petty tyrants are given unchecked power, and how prejudice can hide behind the language of rules and regulations. Her fight exposed a darkness lurking beneath the surface of suburban perfection. Her victory served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound change begins when one person, pushed to the absolute limit, finally decides to stop complying and start fighting back. And so, her story leaves us with a critical question. How many other Evelyns are out there, being silently crushed by systems that have forgotten how to be human? And what will it take for us to hear them before it's too late? The story of Evelyn Miller, on its surface, appears to be a shocking but ultimately contained narrative of injustice. A single woman pushed to the brink by a single, overzealous homeowners association. It is a tale of brown grass, escalating fines, and a week in jail that culminates in a satisfying David versus Goliath victory. Yet, to leave the analysis there, to confine its meaning to the manicured lawns of Harmony Creek, would be to miss the story's true, sprawling, and deeply unsettling significance. Evelyn's ordeal is not an anomaly, it is a symptom. It is a perfectly focused microcosm of a much larger societal sickness, a story that holds up a mirror to the quiet, insidious ways that power, prejudice, and bureaucracy intertwine to crush the human spirit. To truly understand the impact of what happened to Evelyn, we must peel back the layers of suburban placidity and examine the rot beneath. We must look beyond the single patch of dead grass and see the vast, barren landscape of empathy it represents. This is not merely the resolution of one woman's struggle. It is a profound and urgent diagnosis of a modern condition, a call to examine the very architecture of our communities and the silent contracts we sign when we choose to live within them. At its core, Evelyn's story is a masterclass in how mundane systems can be weaponized. The Harmony Creek HOA bylaws, like countless similar documents in communities across the nation, were likely drafted with anodyne intentions to protect property values, to ensure a baseline of aesthetic cohesion, to prevent neighborhood decay. On paper, these rules are impartial, clinical, and objective. A lawn is either green or it is not. A fence is either the correct height or it is not. This veneer of objectivity is precisely what makes such systems so dangerous. It provides the perfect camouflage for personal prejudice and targeted harassment. Carol, the head of the Architectural Control Committee, did not need to use slurs or explicit threats to destroy Evelyn's life. She had a far more powerful weapon at her disposal: the rule book. Every action she took was, technically, justifiable within the framework of the HOA's governing documents. She sent a notice, as stipulated. She levied a fine, as authorized. She engaged a law firm, as was her right. She coordinated with law enforcement to act on a warrant that was legally obtained. At every step of the way, Carol could, and likely did, defend her actions as simply enforcing the rules. She was not a villain in her own mind. She was a diligent administrator, a faithful steward of the community standards. This is the first and most crucial lesson from Evelyn's ordeal. Oppression in the modern age often wears the mask of procedure. The greatest tyrannies are not always born of lawlessness, but of the rigid, unthinking, and inhumane application of the law. The system itself becomes the bludgeon. It allows individuals like Carol to inflict immense cruelty without ever having to acknowledge their own malice. They can hide their personal vendettas, their racial biases, their simple lust for power behind the impersonal language of Section 8, Paragraph 4. The bureaucracy absolves them of personal responsibility. They are not the ones punishing the grieving widow, the bylaws are. This phenomenon extends far beyond the realm of HOAs. We see it in zero-tolerance policies in schools that punish children for minor infractions with life-altering consequences. We see it in Byzantine social welfare systems that require mountains of paperwork from the most vulnerable, creating barriers to aid that are ostensibly about accountability but function as a form of gatekeeping. We see it in corporate structures where soulless policies are invoked to justify layoffs, deny benefits, or enforce working conditions that are detrimental to human health and dignity. In every case, the structure itself is designed to create distance between the decision-maker and the human being their decision affects. It transforms a person into a case file, a violation number, a compliance issue. Evelyn's humanity was systematically erased by this process. She was not a woman struggling with the recent tragic death of her husband. She was the property at 12 Sycamore Lane. Her grief was not a valid human experience deserving of compassion and accommodation. It was an unacceptable deviation from community standards. The brown grass was not a symbol of her pain. It was a failure to maintain aesthetic uniformity. By reducing her to a series of violations, the HOA gave itself permission to treat her inhumanely. This is the ultimate power of weaponized bureaucracy. It provides a moral shield for the immoral, allowing ordinary people to become agents of extraordinary cruelty, all while telling themselves they are simply doing their job. The story of Harmony Creek is also a story about the American suburb and the subtle, often unspoken, pressures of conformity that govern such spaces. The very name, Harmony Creek, is a piece of marketing genius, promising a life of peaceful, pleasant coexistence. But what is the price of this harmony? As Evelyn discovered, the price is the erasure of individuality. The harmony is not one of diverse instruments playing together, but of a single monotonous note held indefinitely. Planned communities are, by their very nature, exercises in control. They are designed to be predictable, safe, and stable environments, and they achieve this by eliminating variables. The rules governing the height of fences, the color of front doors, the types of plants one can grow, and the visibility of trash cans are all part of a larger project to sand down the rough edges of human existence. They are an attempt to impose order on the chaos of life. For many, like Evelyn's late husband, David, this order provides a sense of security and peace. It creates a world that is legible and manageable. However, this enforced order has a dark side. When conformity becomes the highest virtue, anything that deviates from the norm is perceived not just as different, but as a threat. Evelyn's brown lawn was a threat. It was a tear in the perfect fabric of the neighborhood. It was a visible reminder of things the community was designed to keep hidden: pain, loss, decay, and imperfection. In a world where the collective identity is built on a foundation of perfect lawns and matching mailboxes, one woman's public display of grief becomes an act of rebellion, whether she intends it to be or not. This pressure to conform is not applied equally. As Evelyn began to suspect, and as the subsequent lawsuit would prove, the rules were a net used to catch certain kinds of fish. Her status as one of the few black homeowners in Harmony Creek made her deviation more visible, more scrutinized, and ultimately more punishable. The unspoken contract of the suburbs has often been one of white, middle-class homogeneity. Historically, this was enforced through explicit means, like racially restrictive covenants and redlining. Today, the mechanisms are often more subtle, but the goal can be the same. The enforcement of aesthetic standards can become a proxy for enforcing social and racial exclusivity. An overgrown yard, a car parked on the street, or a basketball hoop left in the driveway can become coded signals for people who don't belong here. The HOA, led by Carol, was acting as the immune system of the community, identifying Evelyn as a foreign agent and attempting to purge her. Her violation was not merely aesthetic, it was existential. She was disrupting the carefully curated illusion of suburban perfection. Her pain was messy, and Harmony Creek was a place for tidiness. Her circumstances were complicated, and Harmony Creek was a place for simplicity. Her blackness made her stand out, and Harmony Creek was a place for blending in. The impact of this extends to the very soul of what it means to be a neighbor. In a community governed by control and conformity, true connection becomes impossible. Neighbors cease to be fellow human beings and instead become potential violators or enforcers. A friendly chat over the fence is replaced by a sideways glance at the height of that fence. Concern for a neighbor's well-being is replaced by concern for how their unkempt garden might affect property values. The system encourages residents to see each other not as people, but as assets or liabilities in a collective portfolio. Evelyn's neighbors, peering through their curtains as she was arrested, were not just being nosy. They were participants in the system, their silence a form of complicity, their inaction a vote in favor of the established order. They were choosing the illusion of harmony over the reality of human decency. Perhaps the most heartbreaking element of Evelyn's story is the profound failure of empathy she encountered at every turn. Her grief was not a secret. She explained her situation at the HOA meeting, laying her vulnerability bare in the desperate hope of being understood. She was not asking for a permanent exemption from the rules, but for a temporary grace period, for a simple acknowledgement of her humanity. What she received in return was a cold, clinical recitation of her contractual obligations. This moment in the sterile community clubhouse is a chilling indictment of a society that has forgotten how to care for its wounded. The board members saw her pain not as a call for compassion, but as an administrative problem to be solved. Her story did not fit into their neat columns of violations and remedies. It was an inconvenient variable that complicated their otherwise straightforward enforcement process. And so, they chose to ignore it. They chose procedure over people, rules over reality. This failure of empathy is a uniquely modern phenomenon. In older, more organic communities, the social fabric itself was the support system. A death in the family would trigger an immediate communal response. Neighbors bringing food, offering to mow the lawn, watching the children, providing a shoulder to cry on. These were not codified rules, but instinctual acts of human solidarity. In the artificial ecosystem of Harmony Creek, these instincts have atrophied. The HOA has replaced the community. The bylaws have replaced the bonds of mutual support. Instead of receiving a casserole, Evelyn received a fine. Instead of a helping hand, she was met with a threat of legal action. The system itself discourages empathy. By framing every interaction as a potential transaction or violation, it conditions residents to be wary of one another. To help Evelyn might be seen as condoning her violation. To speak up for her at the meeting might put oneself in the crosshairs of the board. It is safer to remain silent, to mind one's own business, and to keep one's own lawn perfectly green. The result is a profound and terrifying isolation. Evelyn was surrounded by people, living mere feet away from her, yet she was utterly alone in her suffering. The very community that was supposed to provide safety and belonging became the source of her persecution. This emotional isolation is a critical component of her trauma. The arrest and the jail time were the physical manifestations of the punishment, but the emotional wound was inflicted long before the handcuffs clicked. It was inflicted by the cold, dismissive tone of the letters. It was inflicted by Carol's smug, judgmental gaze. It was inflicted by the impassive faces of the board members. It was inflicted by the silence of her neighbors. Each of these moments was a small death, an erosion of her faith in the goodness of others. The wildflower garden she plants at the end is therefore an act of radical defiance. It is not just a rejection of the HOA's aesthetic standards, it is a rejection of their emotional sterility. Wildflowers are messy, unpredictable, and untamed. They are a symbol of life in all its chaotic, resilient beauty. By planting that garden, Evelyn is reintroducing a vital human element into the sterile landscape of Harmony Creek. She is creating a space for imperfection, for memory, and for life that refuses to be neatly controlled. It is a testament to the fact that true community is not built on conformity, but on the grace we extend to one another, especially in times of sorrow. It is a declaration that a human heart, even a broken one, is more important than a blade of grass. When all institutional channels failed her, Evelyn turned to the one remaining avenue of appeal, the court of public opinion. Her decision to contact an investigative reporter was not just a clever tactic, it was an act of profound desperation. The system had proven to be a closed loop, incapable of self-correction. The HOA, the lawyers, and the police were all cogs in the same machine, each part reinforcing the other. The only way to break the cycle was to expose it to the light. The viral explosion of her story reveals a deep and abiding public hunger for justice, especially when the injustice is so absurd and relatable. People who had never heard of Harmony Creek, who lived thousands of miles away, felt a connection to Evelyn's plight. They recognized the arrogance of the petty tyrant. They understood the frustration of battling a faceless bureaucracy. They felt the sting of an injustice that was technically legal but morally bankrupt. Her story became a vessel for their own anxieties and resentments about the countless small ways that systems fail individuals. This highlights the critical role of narrative in a modern, media-saturated world. A single, well-told story can be more powerful than an army of lawyers. It can bypass the gatekeepers of power and speak directly to the conscience of the public. It can shame institutions into action in a way that internal appeals never could. The news vans that descended on Sycamore Lane were a physical manifestation of this power. They represented the collective gaze of the nation, a gaze that Carol and the board could not ignore. The shame they had so publicly inflicted upon Evelyn was now returned to them 1,000-fold. The creation of the online support group, the sharing of other HOA horror stories, the flood of angry comments, all of this demonstrates the power of shared narrative to build solidarity. Evelyn, who had been so utterly isolated, suddenly found herself at the center of a massive, impromptu community. These were not her neighbors in the geographical sense, but they were her true neighbors in the human sense. They offered the support, validation, and outrage that the residents of Harmony Creek had failed to provide. This digital community became a powerful counterweight to the institutional power of the HOA. However, we must also consider the precariousness of this form of justice. What if Evelyn's story hadn't been picked up? What if the reporter had dismissed it? What if it had failed to capture the public's imagination? Justice should not have to depend on a story going viral. A person's right to be treated with dignity and compassion should not be contingent on their ability to generate clicks and shares. The fact that Evelyn had to resort to public shaming to achieve a just outcome is in itself a damning indictment of the system. It underscores the reality that for many, especially those who are marginalized, the formal channels of justice are often inaccessible or ineffective. The legal aid fund Evelyn establishes is a direct response to this reality. It is an attempt to institutionalize the support she received, to create a permanent resource for others who find themselves in a similar fight. It is an acknowledgement that while a powerful narrative can be a catalyst for change, it is not a substitute for systemic reform and accessible legal representation. Her victory was not just in winning her settlement, but in using her newfound platform and resources to forge a new tool for others, ensuring that the next Evelyn Miller would not have to fight alone. The story of Harmony Creek concludes, but its impact reverberates. It leaves us with a profound sense of unease, a mandate to look more closely at the communities we inhabit and the rules we agree to live by. Evelyn's wildflower garden stands as a beautiful, defiant symbol, but the underlying structures that led to her persecution remain in place in countless neighborhoods across the country. The Carols of the world have not vanished. They are still attending board meetings, still carrying clipboards, still looking for deviations from the norm. The final impact of Evelyn's story, then, is a call to action. It is a call for a more vigilant and empathetic form of citizenship. It asks us to be the neighbors that Evelyn needed but did not have. It challenges us to be the lone voice at the HOA meeting who stands up and says, "This is wrong." It compels us to question rules that are applied unevenly and to challenge procedures that prioritize property values over human dignity. This requires a fundamental shift in perspective. We must learn to see our neighbors not as potential threats to our investment, but as fellow human beings navigating the often messy realities of life. We must recognize that a community's true value lies not in the uniformity of its lawns, but in the strength of its social bonds and the depth of its collective compassion. A truly harmonious community is not one where everyone is the same, but one where difference is tolerated, where vulnerability is met with grace, and where the instinct to help is stronger than the instinct to judge. Evelyn's ordeal serves as a stark warning. The path from a minor bylaw to a gross injustice is shorter and more slippery than we think. It is paved with apathy, silence, and the quiet assumption that the rules are always right. To prevent other stories like hers, we must actively resist the dehumanizing pull of bureaucracy. We must insist on seeing the person behind the case file, the pain behind the violation. We must have the courage to choose empathy over enforcement and humanity over harmony. Ultimately, the brown patch on Evelyn's lawn was a diagnostic test, and the community of Harmony Creek failed it spectacularly. The question the story leaves us with is this: if that same test were administered in our own neighborhood, in our own city, in our own lives, how would we score? Would we be the ones peering through the curtains, silent and complicit? Would we be the ones at the meeting nodding along as the rules are recited? Or would we be the ones who would walk across the street, knock on the door, and ask a simple, human question? "I see you're struggling. How can I help?" The answer to that question defines not only the character of our communities, but the very content of our own character. Evelyn Miller found her strength in the depths of despair, but her story is a plea for us to find ours in the light of our everyday lives, before the sirens ever have to sound.